There's a new JK collection release for Breeders' Cup 2022, the Winchell Epicenter Gold Label. Epicenter NFT owners have special access to this limited edition JK button-up celebrating Ron Winchell and all his success in the thoroughbred game. The Winchell Gold Label shirt available at openstable.io. Lots of extras while supplies last. Openstable.io. And if you just want to get the shirt without the gold label, oldsmokeclothing.com. The Breeders' Cup Classic, always a fascinating race, maybe more so than usual this year. PTF with you here back in the bunker, bringing in a guest we love to talk with on our airwaves. We just had him over on Horseplayer Happy Hour. We're here to get his thoughts on the Classic. You know him from the NBC broadcast, his work with the Beyer Speed Figure team. Randy Moss, how are things?
Hey, things are fine, Pete. Getting ready for the Breeders' Cup. The Classic in particular is...
I did something cheeky to you on the airwaves of Horseplayer Happy Hour when I asked you about that one horse, but I excluded this race. I was assuming if you just had one horse to watch, if I were to make you pick one, and I gave you the whole open playing field, I'm assuming it would be in this race. Is that reasonable?
I think that's a pretty good assumption, Pete, with Flightline. We'll dive into this, but, you know, this race is so fascinating from a historical perspective, from a legacy perspective regarding Flightline, that, in my opinion, if just average sports fans out there that know nothing about horse racing knew all the particulars about this race and Flightline and what was sort of at stake watching Flightline from just an athletic achievement standpoint, the ratings for this race would be off the charts. People that knew nothing about horse racing would tune in just to see if Flightline's performance in the Pacific Classic could really be for real and could really be the standard that this horse will have in the Breeders' Cup Classic. It's really, really compelling.
Let's talk about this race from a figure point of view first, because I think it's really interesting to see where the Beyer team landed with the 126 figure on Flightline. I heard a lot of figure maker types right after the race heading into the final round of Breeders' Cup prep saying, you know what, that figure could have even been higher. I feel like the 126 after the last round of Breeders' Cups and seeing that some of those horses run back comes out smelling like a rose and looking exactly right. Where do you stand with that 126 figure? You feeling really good about it? And then, of course, the bigger question, what do you expect him to do figure-wise in the Breeders' Cup Classic?
Yeah, well, sometimes, unfortunately, more often than we would prefer, there's a little bit of wiggle room when it comes to making speed figures, especially nowadays. You get racetracks that card so many grass races and few dirt races to look at, and there's not a big sort of body of evidence on any given race day as to what the variance should be on dirt. Del Mar on the day of the Pacific Classic wasn't exactly one of those. We would have preferred to see more dirt races even than we did see more two-turn dirt races. We obviously spent a lot of time on the figure for this race, and we all, the three of us really, Andy Beyer, Mark Hopkins, and myself, came to the conclusion that the most logical speed figure was the 126 that we assigned Flightline. But you can also make a case that the figure could have been as high as a 132. We stand by 126. I think 126 is the most likely, and if it's the most likely, that's the one you have to go by. But it's not inconceivable that Flightline could have run as fast as a 132, which obviously in the world of thoroughbred racing is otherworldly, and it puts him right up there with Secretariat's 31 length win in the Belmont.
What was the figure? Now, well, they weren't published back then, but if you have it off the top of your head, what was the Secretariat Belmont figure?
Yeah, Andy's done a lot of work on that in the decades since, and I believe Andy came up with 136 or so as the likely fig for that Belmont day.
The 126 in its own, 126, 132. From a horse playing point of view, how much does it even matter? It's so far ahead of what we're used to seeing horses run in the modern era, in any era, really. is this horse just completely nailed on for the Breeders' Cup Classic in your view?
If we can dive into this a little bit, Pete, this is what I'm talking about now, what I'm about to get into, that makes it so interesting, not just for horse racing fans, but just for sports fans in general, right? When you talk about athletic achievement in any sport, the pinnacle of athletic achievement, I like to compare it to golf. I think that's a pretty good analogy. We all know how good Tiger Woods was in his heyday. And Tiger Woods, obviously, at his peak, was regarded as one of, if not the greatest golfer of all time by his contemporaries, his predecessors like Jack Nicklaus, right? So as good as Tiger Woods was, if Tiger Woods had gone out, let's say in the first round of the Masters, and had shot a 62 on an extremely tough Augusta National course, right? Everybody would be raving about how it was one of the single greatest rounds of golf ever played, right? But when Tiger Woods stepped on the tee for the first hole on day 2 of the Masters, no one would be expecting him to shoot another 62. Tiger wouldn't have expected himself to go out there and shoot 62 2 days in a row. Why not? Well, because we have a long body of work in golf to look back on to tell us that it is highly improbable for anyone to go out and shoot back-to-back 62s. And we have a whole history of Tiger Woods beforehand that would suggest that, yes, he's capable of shooting a 62, but to make that the norm going forward is not impossible. If you can shoot a 62 once, you can shoot a 62 all 4 rounds, but it's just highly improbable, okay? When Secretariat won the Belmont Stakes by 31 lengths and earned, we'll say, that 136 Beyer Speed Figure, okay? He was beaten twice after that. You know, he was beaten by Onion. He was beaten by Prove Out. He never duplicated that 136. He ran some amazing races. He was one of the greatest, if not the greatest horse of all time, certainly in modern times, I think most people would agree. But he never actually duplicated that Belmont Stakes again. Now, Flightline steps into a completely different, sphere when he wins the Pacific Classic by 19 3/4 lengths, okay? Is it likely to be his normal race at 1 1/4 miles? It's the best race he'd ever run in his career by far. It's the best race I think we've seen since Secretariat's Belmont Stakes. History would tell us that it's unlikely that he's going to come back and run that well again. But it was the first time in his life he had ever been around 2 turns. It was the first time in his life he had ever been 1 1/4 miles. What if Flightline is the equivalent of a golfer who now can go out and make 62 the norm, the average? Okay. Can you imagine in any sport that sort of athletic excellence, being put on display as sort of the par, as sort of the norm for any athlete, and for this case, a racehorse like Flightline? Now, does that make him unbeatable in the Breeders' Cup Classic? Secretariat was beaten twice after the Belmont. So no, you can pick out little points about Flightline and his running style that, you could possibly envision a vulnerability in the Classic. But it's just fascinating to see if this is going to be the norm, what we saw in the Pacific Classic, the norm for Flightline at 1 1/4 miles going forward. I think it's amazing to think about.
It's one of the great stories for sure that I've seen in my time as a racing fan. Now, I want to explore those vulnerabilities, but first I'll underline the case, and Jonathan Kinchin made this on one of our Breeders' Cup prediction videos. I'll underline the case of why it could be the norm, or as JK even had the wildness to suggest, that he could even run a better number potentially. The idea that we've seen for many horses that the second time they do something, they tend to be a little bit more familiar, ration their energy better, familiar with the task at hand, can do it better. The idea that the surface might be more lending to a faster effort, and the idea that this is it. I mean, look, there's been some talk about maybe Flightline running at 4 or running at 5. I'm not necessarily buying it. I think this is probably it.
Probably.
Certainly the idea that the Pacific Classic, though, that they would have held something in reserve with the idea of this race, that impediment is out the window. So I have some sympathy for the idea that he could run as well, if not better. I want to talk about the other side of the coin, though, Randy. What are the vulnerabilities that you were describing? What did you see? Is that something you're seeing on the tape?
Yeah, I could see one vulnerability, and that's pretty much it. When you, the day of the Pacific Classic, I was at Saratoga to cover the Jockey Club Gold Cup for NBC. And I had dinner with my friend, Mr. Bailey, and another very prominent person involved in the horse racing industry. I won't mention his name, but knows as much about horse racing as anybody I know. And modern technology being as wonderful as it is, we could sit at dinner as we did, and we could watch the Pacific Classic on our phones. And we talked about the Pacific Classic beforehand, and this person, again, whose opinion I hold in unbelievably high esteem, said that he believed that Flightline was very vulnerable going 1.25 miles because of his innate natural aggressiveness. And he had talked to people close to Flightline who said that that's Flightline's norm, that Flightline is not uncontrollable, but he can be very headstrong, and he could be his own worst enemy trying to ration his speed going 1.25 miles. And for that reason, this guy thought that Flightline was vulnerable going into the Pacific Classic. And so we watched the race sitting at the dinner table. And Flightline is nice and relaxed in the run through the stretch the first time, and he's nice and relaxed around the first turn. And then they turn onto the backstretch, and he basically runs off with Flavien Prat. And Pratt's got his feet in the dashboard, and he's restraining Flightline. And Flightline says, "The hell with this, I'm going." And I'm thinking to myself right then, I'm thinking, this he could be right. This could be a situation. I mean, we're at the 3/4 pole, and Flightline is saying, "I'm going." And he just dragged Flavien Prat to the lead. And of course, we all saw what happened. It was not, it turned out to be not a vulnerability at all in the Pacific Classic. But now, fast forward, let's go to the Breeders' Cup Classic. Flightline is going to be competing against a horse. And depending on what we actually get from Life is Good in the Breeders' Cup Classic, I think it's you can say pretty definitively, it's the fastest horse that Flightline will ever have chased. And if we get the absolute best Life is Good that we've seen, and with Todd Pletcher calling the shots, that's certainly a plausible possibility. Then going down the backstretch, we know Life is Good can be aggressive when they turn up the backstretch. If Life is Good becomes aggressive and Flightline becomes aggressive right behind him, and Flightline runs up to hook Life is Good, let's say at the 5.5 pole, and both of them at that point become extremely competitive and try to run off, and they're side by side battling each other for a while, that could conceivably at 1.25 miles become a vulnerability for Flightline if someone behind him runs well enough to perhaps come and get him in the last part of the race. And that someone could be Epicenter based on the way he ran in the Travers and his development so far as a 3-year-old. It could be Taba based on the way he ran in the Pennsylvania Derby. There are some possibilities that will be sitting behind Flightline and Life is Good that could pick up the pieces if that vulnerability does come into play.
Let's talk about Epicenter for a minute, because this is another figure I wanted to pick your brain about. I feel, and no offense intended here, but I feel like with subsequent events to the Travers, I feel like that figure, and I've said this publicly, but that figure feels like it might be a little bit high to me, coming back at the 112. Not that it's way off or anything, and I love Epicenter, and I still think he's progressive, and I agree he's one of the interesting ones. But I was just curious if you'd look back at that number at all, and how you felt about it, and how you felt about the chances of Epicenter maybe being fast enough to take advantage of the scenario you just described.
Oh, I look back at all the figures with the benefit of hindsight. And obviously, we don't have the benefit of hindsight when we make the number day of. But I can say I think 112 is the most logical figure, which is why we went with it, similar to the 126 for Flightline. But I can tell you with a high degree of confidence that if it's not 112, it's either 110 or 111.
Okay.
Okay. It's going to be no slower than 110. Even if you look at it the most critical way possible with the way those horses came back. Cyberknife had a gorgeous trip in the Travers. I remember I actually bet the Epicenter Cyberknife Exacta. I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but I'm just pointing out the reason I did was because there was very little early speed in that Travers, and Cyberknife had an inside post. I think he had the inside post, and he was going to be the horse that was going to control the early pace. And therefore, I thought he was probably primed to run the race of his life in that scenario. So I think when you look at the fig for the Travers, I think you got to keep that in mind as well. And then we saw what Zandon came back and ran in the Pennsylvania Derby. He's a very nice horse as well. So Epicenter ran a very good race in the Travers.
I mean, I think that number, even if you deduct 2 points from it, obviously, if you're beating Flightline, you're projecting that something has to make him regress. He seems like as likely a horse as any to turn the tables when it comes to the big race. Of course, there's another 3-year-old we have to talk about too.
Well, Taba, yeah, exactly. And when you look at Flightline and you look at Taba, I mean, you look at their figures. Keep in mind now that these are 3-year-olds who tend to improve as the year goes on, right? When you look at American Pharoah in the Breeders' Cup Classic in 2015, now he obviously had everything completely his own way in the running of the race at Keeneland. There was no competing early speed against him whatsoever. And that, of course, was a recipe for a 10-length win, which is what we saw from American Pharoah. I don't remember exactly where I'm going with this. Oh, 3-year-olds developing through the course of the year. American Pharoah ran the best race of his life in the Breeders' Cup Classic late in his 3-year-old year. And I think
120 was it that high? It was
121. And I think we've seen that. It might have been 120. In my mind, it was 121. But I think we've seen that with a lot of 3-year-olds when they get to the Pacific, when they get to the Breeders' Cup Classic. Yeah. So
last horse, I have to ask you about Rich Strike before we get out of here, but I didn't mean to derail your momentum. Yeah. I think Rich Strike has an opportunity with the right kind of trip to get on the board here. I don't think he can necessarily win, but I'm going to run some of my money in this race through Rich Strike running second and third to these other logicals we're talking about. Am I off my rocker, or can you see it?
No, I don't think you're off your rocker. I mean, I said on the NBC telecast for the Lucas Classic that I thought Rich Strike ran an outstanding race in the Travers. I actually thought he was the second best horse on Travers Day behind Epicenter. I thought he got a bad ride by Sonny Leon. As good as Sonny Leon rode the horse in the Kentucky Derby, he was actually on the engine with Rich Strike at the 4.5 furlong pole, which to me is just completely outrageous. And yet the horse was still digging in during the last part of the Travers. I thought he ran a heck of a race. And I expected him to run a really good race in the Lucas Classic. Now, the Breeders' Cup Classic, let's say you get that scenario where you get a very fast pace with Life is Good and Epicenter breathing down his neck. You can certainly make, Flightline breathing down his neck. You can certainly make the case that if Flightline runs even close to the way he ran in the Pacific Classic and he runs past Life is Good, that when you're betting exotics, that Life is Good would be a good throw out, because at that point, he's a speed horse who's been displaced, let's say at the half-mile pole. He's running 1.25 miles, which might be beyond his preferred distance anyway. The pace is going to be fast. I think chances are at that point that Life is Good. This sort of denigrating Life is Good. But at that point, I think there would be a better chance that he would run last than first. Okay. So you take Life is Good out of the exotics equation. Hot Rod Charlie is a horse that likes to be fairly close up early. And if he can't keep up early, and there's a chance he could get discouraged. Same thing with Olympiad. We saw what happened when Olympiad tried to go after Life is Good in the Whitney. and he couldn't really make any headway on him at the half-mile pole. And at that point, Olympiad said, "The heck with this, I'm out of here." And you can see you can see the same thing happening in the Breeders' Cup Classic. So you throw out Life is Good, you throw out Hot Rod Charlie, you throw out Olympiad. At that point, logically, you're left with Flightline, and you're left with Epicenter and Taba, and you're left with Rich Strike.
Yeah.
And if Sonny Leon can muster up just a scintilla of patience during the early part of the race, and if he doesn't, lean over and try to elbow anybody in the run to the wire, you can. I think I would put another rider on him. I was going to say,
is there a chance, and we're recording this early, but is there a chance they take him off? He's earned to be jocked off.
Eric Reed is firmly in the Sonny Leon camp, and
Okay.
Sonny Leon rode an amazing race in the Kentucky Derby. But I think what we saw in the Travers and what we saw in the Lucas Classic, I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it. I'm paid to give my opinion. I think we see why Sonny Leon rides at Belterra and not Belmont.
Right.
But look, with Sonny Leon, if Sonny Leon can be patient during the first part of the Breeders' Cup Classic and not try to keep Rich Strike within 4 or 5 lengths of the pace and let him drop back, not as far back as he was in the Kentucky Derby, but let him, drop back and capitalize on the early pace, I don't think it's improbable at all to see Rich Strike come running late and, let's say, get third.
Yeah. That is, I mean, I wouldn't put much, if anything, on the nose, but that second or third, there are scenarios, and I don't think he's going to get a ton of market respect. We'll see, though. It can be a strange market in a race like the Breeders' Cup Classic with so many eyes on it. This is going to be a great event, Randy. Really looking forward to all of your coverage. I kept you way too long today, and I enjoyed myself so much. We may just have to bother you again before we get to the big days, and we look forward to seeing you in any case. Thank you so much for your time.
Take care, Pete. Anytime.